Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions, pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.
Hey, History of Persia fans. Before Persia, another civilization controlled the Middle East, the very first civilization, the inventors of writing itself. From the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia come the oldest stories. The history and myth of the first Mesopotamians is the subject of the Oldest Stories podcast online at oldeststories.net. If you like ancient history, come check out the Oldest Stories after you listen to this episode.
Rest in peace.
Descansa en paz.
Repose en paix.
Riposere in pace.
Neospotual pokoju.
You've died, but don't worry. We here at Quest Friends are here to help you with your afterlife onboarding process.
As you know, the worlds of the living and the dead aren't that far apart.
And you might think, I don't need to learn anything new.
But you'd be wrong.
Dead wrong.
That's why over at QuestFriendsPodcast.com, we release fun, improvised adventures in a world where the realm of the dead is only a plane ride away. Inspired by cartoons like The Owl House and Gravity Falls. So whether you've recently departed or are just visiting, welcome!
Bienvenido!
Bienvenue! Benvenuti!
Witai.
And thank you for dying with Quest Friends.
Hello, I am Steven, one half of the podcast Imperfect Men.
I'm Cody, the other half of Imperfect Men. We discuss the people widely considered founding fathers, their contributions to our country's founding documents, their legacy, and whether they're a founding father or a floundering father.
So follow us on Twitter at Imperfect Men Pod and listen and download us from any of your favorite podcast platforms.
I'm Cody.
And I'm Steven.
And we are Imperfect Men.
This show is part of the Grand Embassy Productions. Gamarjoba, and welcome to the history of Saqartvelo, Georgia. I'm your host, Roberto, and this is episode 47, Tribunal of the Regicides. In today's episode, we'll cover the trial of the Romans who killed King Gubaz II. This show could not run without our wonderful Patreon members, who consistently support us month to month to make sure we can keep the podcast going. Thank you to Vincent Vecchione, Jeremy Chamberlain, John Aaron, Vivek Dandekar, Daniel Boline, Gracie D, Konstantina Meglilishvili, David Montgomery, Quinn Campagna, Emily Bivona, Hal the Legionnaire, Hallie Kuntz, Eric Nicholson, Mitchell Dutt, and Andrew Schneider. You are all amazing, and thank you for everything. We'll be doing an AMA for episode 50. We are on episode 47. We're getting close. Feel free to send in questions about anything you'd like to know to the history of Saqartvelo, Georgia at gmail.com, with the subject being AMA. You can also DM me in socials asking questions. Just put AMA at the beginning of the message. Or you can become a Patreon member at the $5 or up tier, join our Discord, and ask it there and chat with the other listeners. King Gubaz II of Lazi was dead for over a year at this point. The Roman victory at Polti brought an uneasy ceasefire between the Romans and the Persians, at least within Lazi territory. As the ceasefire progressed, however, the Lazi people dwelled ever more on the murder of their beloved King Gubaz II, and the Romans needed all the help they could get to solidify their hold on Lazi. Figuring that the newly crowned Zaf II would be more willing to assist them in that effort if the murderers were brought to justice, Emperor Justinian dispatched Senator Athanasius. The senator from Constantinople was to preside over the trial of John and Rusticus, the alleged killers. The Persian siege of Polti initially delayed the trial, but with that inconvenience out of the way, Athanasius could finally begin to see if they really were as guilty as the Lazi said, or if they were mere victims of tragic circumstance. Athanasius took on the role of civil magistrate over the trial, which gave him judicial and administrative authority in civil matters. In typical Roman fashion, it was also his job to ensure that there was a lot of pomp and circumstance around the whole thing, not only doing what was expected of the glorious empire, but also drawing the people's attention to the good deed it was doing on behalf of its Lazi friends. The Lazi people needed to know that the Romans were on their side, to see the power of Roman justice, and to make the Lazi more pliable to Roman rule for potential integration later. In the eyes of the Lazi, a very public execution would cast the Romans as the avenging angel of their fallen leader. Of course, there's still the matter of the trial. In order to demonstrate that this tribunal was capital I important, it was structured as a series of speeches where the defense and prosecution got to show off their oratory skills, which was all the more exciting because the lives of two men were on the line. Before we jump into the tribunal itself, let's review why the accused were in this position in the first place. If you recall from previous episodes, John and Rusticus played the biggest part in King Gubaz II's murder. No good murder investigation is complete without establishing a motive, and they had a few good reasons to be angry with him. First, he had become irate with the Roman generals for losing ground to the Persians and took to openly mocking and dishonoring them. Second, he repeatedly threatened to ask Justinian to remove them from their position for their ineptitude. Third, they suspected that he was thinking of allying with the Persians against the Romans. Longtime listeners will note that historic Georgian kings kind of had a habit of playing the Roman and Persian empires off of each other. John and Rusticus brought in a third commander, Martin, and arranged a meeting with Gubaz to suss out if he would really switch sides. Ironically, Emperor Justinian was not only aware of this plan, but also gave them permission to bring him to Constantinople to stand trial for treason if they found sufficient evidence. If he refused to come with them, he also gave them his blessing to kill him then and there. The problem was that John and Rusticus allegedly bypassed all that and just killed him. This just goes to show why you should always try to get along with your coworkers, especially if their grandparents used to feed people to lions for fun. Predictably, the first piece of evidence the Lazi nobility presented in the trial was a letter giving the accused explicit permission to kill Gubaz. Athanasius admitted this evidence despite the damage it would do to the Romans' image. In the letter, Justinian expressed his shock at Gubaz's alleged betrayal, but acknowledged that it was possible that this was all a misunderstanding. He therefore issued the following orders. Quote, Gubaz should come to Constantinople. Send him therefore with all speed, whether of his own free will or by force. If knowing that this is our pleasure, he nevertheless resists and refuses to come, then you will seize him and drag him off, and you will be fully entitled to do so in these circumstances. If, moreover, he tries to break away and fights back, if in fact he resorts to any form of violent opposition whatsoever, then we shall have clear proof of criminal intent, and he will thereafter be classed as a public enemy, so that should anyone kill him once he behaved with such effrontery, their action would in our view be quite in order. Consequently, whoever deals with him will not be punished for having acted on his own initiative, since it will not be a question of punishing him as a murderer, but rather of praising him for having killed a rebel." End quote. The Lazi noblemen listened, discussed what to do, and summoned their best orator. He argued that the murder of King Gubaz was not for the common good of Rome or Lazica, since his death is what brought the territory into further turmoil, allowed for greater Persian advances, and made the Lazi withdraw from the war altogether. Furthermore, John and Rusticus disobeyed Justinian and acted as judge, jury, and executioner, killing him as a first resort instead of as an absolute last resort, as their emperor implicitly ordered. Why should the Lazi not therefore do the same and execute John and Rusticus on the spot? Now for Kyle Decker of Quest Friends reading the Lazi argument.
The enormity of the crime committed is in itself sufficient to condemn its perpetrators to the severest of punishments without our uttering a single word. But since it is a requirement of your laws that even in the case of notorious and outrageous offenses, judgment must not be passed until all the facts have been clearly stated, we have come here to give a bare recital of events. In this way, we too shall fulfill the requirements of the law, though our language will be simple and unadorned and quite unequal to the magnitude of the crimes committed. What semblance of an excuse will they find for the cold-blooded murder of a man of such exalted rank, who was bound to you by ties of friendship, alliance, hospitality, and by a common religion, a man, in fine, who possessed all the attributes of a most intimate associate and friend? What vestige of an excuse, then, will be left them once they are shown to have behaved with extreme hostility towards you by virtually promoting the interests of the enemy? The murdered man was a king of no mean nation, a great force for virtue, and one who, far more than his murderers ever did, had always had the interests of the Romans at heart. The Colchian state is in ruins. Indeed, it would be more accurate to say the empire is in ruins, given that we constitute a not inconsiderable fraction of its subjects. The stability and integrity of your regime has been destroyed, and your own power is sadly weakened as a result. For a state which is not firmly supported throughout its entire structure no longer has any title to be considered a unified political entity. Indeed, to call it a state becomes a contradiction in terms once its unity has been drastically impaired. Now, the very men who have brought about this situation say that you must take into account not the appalling consequences of their action, but the spirit in which it was done. And they would have you proceed by an obscure and specious form of argumentation to conjure up a fanciful picture of the benefits that have accrued to you therefrom, rather than give any credence to the manifest harm already experienced. Even before the trial, in fact, they sought by dint of repeating these sophistries to mislead the masses. If therefore they are going to put forward this type of argument in a court of law, then they had better realize that it is not in keeping with the principles of Roman justice to turn a blind eye to such a glaring and flagrant offense in order to be deceived by such obscure allegations and trumped-up charges as theirs. It is intolerable that they should openly admit that they have killed Gubazes and yet persist in making the wild assertion that the common good has benefited immensely from their action. How can such glaring inconsistencies be reconciled? By what logic shall we describe the act as an atrocity while at the same time praising the public-spirited intent of its perpetrators? The two notions of public good and illegal violence have from time immemorial been diametrically opposed. Likewise, cruelty and justice are poles apart. There is no common good between them, and no possible point of contact. But if we confine ourselves to a bare examination of the end in view even on that score, they will be convicted of malice aforethought, since the policy they adopted has the blessing of Persia. These murderers, therefore, are not fit to be called Romans, nor should they be judged with the indulgence extended to one's fellow countrymen, but rather as though they were your worst enemies, since they are already divided from you by common law of humanity, even if not yet by your own written code. For actions, not distance, are the only proper criterion for determining what is alien and hostile. Whoever deliberately plays into the hands of the enemy may himself, with good reason, be deemed an enemy, even if he is close at hand, even if he is serving in the same army, even if he is of the same blood. But they claim that they did not kill a friend or a king, but an enemy, and a rebel and an active sympathizer of Persia. Yes, in their criminal folly, they have even gone so far as to charge the dead man with conspiracy to betray the state to the Persians. And things have now come to such a pass that even in death, the unhappy man has no rest, but must stand trial for high treason in circumstances where he can gain nothing from an acquittal. What law is there in force among yourselves or among barbarians which would sanction the practice of first pronouncing and executing the sentence and then proceeding to draw up the indictment, setting themselves up as judges, enemies, and accusers, all rolled into one? They inflicted upon an innocent man, without even giving him a trial, the punishment appropriate to one who had been genuinely convicted of seeking to assume arbitrary and unconstitutional powers. Now, when they are supposed to be defending themselves, they have come bringing accusations against the victim of their own injustice. Yet if they believed in the charges they are making, they ought first to have embarked openly on criminal proceedings against him and been the first to open a case for the prosecution before killing him, and not have waited until they were themselves accused and then bring out the counter-accusation. If everyone is entitled to do this sort of thing, then why did we not take the law into our hands also and kill these murderous brutes? Since when we were brought to justice, we could always have countered the charges preferred against us by arranging them posthumously with their previous crimes, and thus attempted to demonstrate that two wrongs make a right? Given, in fact, the incontrovertible nature of the evidence for prior events to which we had reacted in anger, we would have been punishing them with greater justice, and the case for the defense would have proceeded with all due propriety. But there is no place for such outrageous conduct, either on our part or on anybody else's. That is, if you are to live according to your traditional standards of legality. For if whoever feels so inclined is permitted to kill off his private enemies in this summary and offhand manner, and the practice becomes such a regular occurrence that no limit is set to criminal daring, how long do you imagine the authority of the judiciary will remain unimpaired? In the mutual slaughter and the endless chain of plots and counterplots that will ensue, you will not be able to punish or bring to heel the culprits in time. And as your nation rushes blindly to destruction, all possibility of impartial investigation will be precluded by a wave of personal vendettas. Yet the accused contend that there is nothing very dreadful about the death of a single individual who happens also to be a traitor, especially in view of the salutary and sobering effect it will have on all your allies. I am in complete agreement. If it is a question of destroying real traitors, then the more, the merrier. The mere fact of ridding the world of such men is in itself a sufficient boon, even if no other benefit derives from the action of their slayers. But if without there being a shred of evidence to convict him, a person of very great distinction is suddenly struck down and punished like a common traitor caught red-handed in the act, one is perhaps entitled to ask exactly how that is meant to have a salutary and sobering effect upon your allies. Surely they would be much more likely to disavow their alliances if they suspected that you were party to such an outrage. Indeed, they could hardly avoid the inescapable conclusion that if you show so little concern for justice and humanity in your dealings with your close friends and associates, you will scarcely prove more reliable in your dealings with strangers who have been recognized merely in response to some sudden and pressing need. But you were not privy to their plan. Nor will the whole Roman people be involved with the guilt which attaches to them as individuals, nor for that matter will your long-standing reputation for honesty, reliability, and justice be eclipsed and overshadowed by their nefarious conduct. On the contrary, it is our opinion that this tribunal has been set up to preserve the good name of the nation, and to make it clear to everybody that you wish to dissociate yourselves entirely from the action of those who have inflicted such cruel and monstrous indignities on the Colchians. Perhaps at this point, the minds of most men are perplexed and undecided. Perhaps they even find your motives open to doubt. But once, my lord, your verdict, which will be their death warrant, is pronounced, then it will become crystal clear that it is your practice not to betray your friends, but to punish those who do wrong.
The case of the Lazi nobility was made, but the Lazi crowd observing the trial were more than confused. Even if they spoke Latin fluently, it would be difficult for anyone untrained in rhetoric to follow. Nevertheless, they enthusiastically voiced their support for their countrymen once their speech was finished. Athanasius paused the tribunal to silently deliberate all the Lazi had just told him.
Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions, pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois-Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, A History of Valois-Burgundy.
The Lazi crowd silently grew indignant, because how could such a speech not bring about the immediate execution of John and Rusticus? What more information did they need? When Athanasius indicated for the defense to make their case, the crowd angrily began to call for their heads. With some difficulty, the Lazi nobility calmed their countrymen. John and Rusticus argued that everything they had done was in service to the emperor, and that whether they were found guilty or innocent, they had achieved their goals and therefore had made peace with death. They declared Gubaz a rebel unworthy of the title of king because of his willingness to let the Persians in and kill the Roman soldiers, defending the very people now calling for their heads. They further attacked the Lazi people's ignorance and barbarous lack of decorum as only indicating their refusal to accept Roman rule, which a civilized culture would be grateful to submit to. And then, they called them uncivilized barbarians some more. They did this pretty much the whole trial, actually. To add insult to injury, they alleged that King Gubaz sent a message in which he called the Persians barbarians and the Romans cowards, and said that Justinian really wasn't as invincible as he believed. To emphasize this point, they claim that Gubaz had shot down a battle plan at the Battle of Onoguris because he believed it was stupid, only to lose to the Persian enemy. Listeners should recall that this last point wasn't true. The Romans did in fact use John and Rusticus' battle plan. In fact, Gubaz had little to no input, and the reason they lost was because it was absolutely terrible. So, between Gubaz's betrayal, his insulting and defamatory comments regarding the emperor and Romans, and his refusal of their amazing plan, John and Rusticus argued they were completely justified in killing him. At the end of the day, they claimed they had a higher loyalty to the empire, plus Martin supported them. Now, for the reading of John and Rusticus' speech by Cody and Stephen from Imperfect Men.
Fortune has given a sudden and unexpected twist to events, with our result that when we should be receiving the greatest rewards, we find ourselves on trial for our lives. Yet we contemplate this ordeal with joy and with conviction that it will redound our credit, since whatever its outcome, it cannot fail to make it still more abundantly clear to all that by our own unaided efforts we have brought about the downfall of a traitor and a rebel and upheld the interests of the emperor. And so even in the event of our being put to death, we would freely accept and welcome the thought of it, were the object of our desire the anguish which is forced upon us. And we shall depart from this life comforted and fortified by our journey into the hereafter, by the conscious certainty that we have left the Romans still in full possession of their Colchian dominions and not yet having fortified them to any foreign power.
If we were standing trial in a Persian court in the presence of Persian judges, it would behoove us to deny most strenuously that we ever did do what in fact we did. We would be in fear and trembling lest our assertions be refuted, and if they were, it is quite conceivable that we should be at a loss how to plead our cause before bitterly hostile judges who were incensed at the failure of their hopes which our actions had brought about. But since it is a Roman who is presiding over the court, what possible grounds could we have for denying what we have done? What need is there for us to justify to you our action, when as a result of it we have done you the signal service of destroying the rebel Gubazes? I say rebel because he does not deserve to be accorded the august title of king. His deeds have shown him to be the negation all that such a title stands for, though our accusers are raising an indignant outcry at what they describe as the outrageous murder of a king. This name, however, should not be applied to the outward trappings of royalty, the jeweled clasp and fancy robe, but to the man who is the active embodiment of justice, whose desires do not cause him to disregard the call of duty, and whose aspirations are kept within their proper bounds. If that was the sort of man we killed, then we have committed a heinous crime. The case of the prosecution is a just one, and the Colchians have every reason to describe us as brutal and vicious murderers. But if the real Gubazes was the complete antithesis of this, if he was prepared to stop at nothing in his efforts to harm us by secretly letting in the Persians and betraying his country to them, can there really be any question as to whether we ought not to have nipped the potential menace in the bud by our timely intervention, rather than allow our deference to the crown to make us play into the hands of the enemy? If, however, anybody receives prior intelligence of some threatening move being contemplated in some particular quarter, and has it in his power to frustrate the design immediately, and having averted the crisis to proceed to take deliberate and concerted action to cope with any possible emergency, it would in such a case be the height of cruelty on his part to resort to punitive measures in advance instead of defending himself by ensuring the possibility of foiling any hostile attempt should the occasion arise. But when one is faced with a fait accompli, against which all remedies are of no avail, when the state is threatened with imminent destruction, and the situation seems to preclude even the faintest ray of hope, then swift and decisive action is the only sane policy, and every effort must be made to avoid suffering some irreparable harm.
Now our accusers may cry shame, infamy, and murder until they burst. They may seize upon such expletives in order to cast the whole affair in a lurid and melodramatic light, and try to force you to consider only the deed itself. But it is for you, in your judicial capacity, to take into account the circumstances that led up to it. to weigh up the causes that impelled us to take action, and from the tightness of the undertaking to establish the honesty of our intentions. We do in fact often see the various towns and city vagrants, thieves, and other types of criminal beheaded or with their feet cut off. And we do not cry shame on the spectacle, inhumane though it may appear to be, nor do we vent our indignation on the authorities concerned with administrating these punishments by calling them savage brutes and cruel fiends. No, we consider the crimes the felons in question have committed, and bear in mind that that is why they are being punished. We rejoice in the harshness of the punishment, since it has not been devised without good reason, as witness the unabatable persistence of criminal activity.
Gubazes, therefore, has been slain by us. And what, might we ask, is so dreadful about slaying a man who is a traitor and an enemy? Our accusers, moreover, have defined the term enemy. They say that it should be applied not to the man who is separated from us by a great distance, but to whoever, even if he is a fellow countryman, seeks to curry favor with the enemy. We, too, consider this to be the best, most accurate, and most realistic view of the matter. Given such a measure of agreement on both sides, then, let us set out to prove by this mutually acceptable criterion that Gubazes was indeed an enemy. For once this has been demonstrated, it will become immediately apparent that its killing was fully justified.
Now, all barbarian peoples are by nature so constituted that even when they are subjects of the Romans, they are far removed in spirit from them and chafing at the imposition of the rule of law. They incline instinctively to turbulent and seditious behavior. There is nothing they would like better than to continue living as their own masters, subject to no outside jurisdiction, and a law unto themselves. And if it is not possible for them to do so, then they strive to attach themselves to those nations with whom they have most in common. But Gubazes, in addition to being tarred with the same brush since he was himself a barbarian by birth, and consequently tainted with the innate treachery of his race, surpassed himself in his wickedness towards us. He no longer deemed it necessary to hide his feelings, but had hastened to put into effect what had hitherto been the secret aspirations of a hostile mind. When we were toiling away and facing every kind of danger in our efforts to frustrate the enemy's plans, he saw fit to stay at home with his fellow countrymen and absent himself from the struggle. But at the same time, he kept a watchful eye on which way the fighting was going. If the Romans achieved some resounding success over the enemy, his immediate reaction was to display of hostility and spite, in which he would seek by mockery to destroy the impression created by our achievements. He would dismiss the whole undertaking as a trifling incident, and its outcome an insignificant and attributable not to ourselves, but to the vagaries of fortune. But if by chance we met with some reserve, and it is not humanly possible to escape such ups and downs, he would set himself up as a critical interpreter of events and immediately exempt fortune from any blame or any part in what had happened. He had already decided in advance that the sole cause for any reverse we experienced was a combination of poor morale, physical incapacity, and unintelligent planning. He would never, as he did when abusing us, seek to explain away the success achieved by the enemy at our expense simply by making some disparaging reference to the fickle, irregular, and irrational behavior of fortune.
He proclaimed these sentiments openly and made them known not only to the Persian forces, for whose benefit he was actively intriguing, but messengers were at once dispatched by him and carried the news to Iberia, to the Alans, to the Swanians, to the barbarians beyond the Caucasus, to more distant and still more distant peoples. Indeed, if they could have traveled to the ends of the earth for him, he would not have declined to send them. His message was, "The Romans are cowards in war and are being beaten by the barbarians." Now his purpose in eagerly pursuing this policy was not just to bring the Roman people into disrepute, though that would of itself be a sufficiently damning proof of his hostile attitude. His efforts were, in fact, directed to a different and more sinister objective. His intention was to undermine as best he could the widespread belief among foreign peoples concerning the triumphant and invincible might of the emperor, and in this way to incite to some rash act of defiance those peoples who had hitherto been overawed and abjectly subservient. How then, in all fairness, are we to describe the perpetrator of these acts? Surely as an enemy rather than as a friend and a well-wisher, an ally and a king, or any other of the fancy titles the prosecution has applied to the rebel Gubazis. Yet both prosecution and defense have conceded that the only way one can tell a friend from an enemy is by the manner in which he reacts to events. Since, therefore, it has now been demonstrated that Gubazes was distressed at our successes and elated at our failures, what earthly reason can barbarians have for inveighing against the laws of the Romans, according to which we are in the habit of punishing or even executing, should the occasion arise, those who engage in riotous and subversive activities? But let us, if you like, set aside all proofs, inferences, and deductions, and, concentrating our attention exclusively on the hard facts of the case, see to what conclusions such a consideration leads us. The fort of the Onoguris had been wrested from the territory of Archaeopolis and was in Persian hands. The presence of an enemy army firmly entrenched within our borders was an unbearable affront. The strategy which found favor with the generals was to launch a full-scale attack on the enemy and destroy or at least drive out what had long constituted a thorn in the flesh and a permanent menace.
We desperately needed the help of the Colchian force, not only in the order that we, with our poor understanding of local geography, might have the benefit of their first-hand knowledge of the terrain, but also in order that we might enlist their active support and cooperation in the struggle against heavily armed troops drawn up behind fortifications, and also in the probability against the reinforced Machiruses. What then were the generals to do in these circumstances? Surely the proper thing for them to do was to ask the leader of the Colchians for assistance, and to draw his attention to the fairness of their request. And that is precisely what they did. He, however, acting in a truly lordly and tyrannical fashion, would not even hear of putting in an appearance, let alone of actively participating in the assault on the fortress. He did not even bother to mask his refusal with some semblance of an excuse. Indeed, he rejected our request out of hand with an air of arrogance, self-importance, which ill became a subject who was paid for his services. Moreover, he persisted in angrily heaping insults on the heads of the generals, as though he imagined such behavior to be courageous and in keeping with the status of a king. Clearly, he no longer meant to defer the open and shameless advocacy of his early designs. Was there then any point in waiting for further proof and displaying the emperor's letter, with the idea that the man who was not prepared to travel even a short distance in his own country would not come to Constantinople? And how would it have been possible, if we had proposed to send him there, when he had already stirred up so much hostility against us, to avoid widespread dissension and bloodshed and open defection and the imminent prospect of the Persian invasion, since we would have to contend with the stubborn and relentless opposition of the public enemy, whilst the people, as a whole, would, like the barbarians they are, readily have accepted their opportunity for indulging in revolutionary violence. A further incentive would, of course, have been provided by the fact that the Persian help would have been forthcoming from very near at hand. And so, when disaster was practically staring us in the face, we made away with the ringleader, and by doing this, suppressed the conspiracy with such ease and promptness that now seems scarcely credible that any threat ever existed.
Our accusers would do well, therefore, to stop bringing up the matter of the letter and abusing us for not having followed its instructions. Is there anyone to whom it is not perfectly obvious that what was written about having to go to Constantinople was there merely to test his intentions and to find out whether he was willing to cooperate and do as he was told? Now, having easily formed a clear idea of his unruly and aggressive frame of mind from his rejection of a smaller request, how could we have been expected to bid him comply with a demand of a more serious nature, instead of having recourse to more direct action which, after exposing ourselves to numerous hazards, we would in the end, in any case, have had to take? Those who, when the time is ripe for action, fail to make an appropriate and decisive response to the situation cannot at a later date recover the lost opportunity. But apparently, to judge from what our accusers have to say, we could still, in the last resort, have brought an action against Gubazes, engaged, that is to say, in a futile battle of words, and chosen the niceties of verbal altercation in preference to the realities of security. But the presence of the Persians did not allow such a procedure, since they were closing in and ready to take over the whole of Lazica with the help of this scheming traitor. Moreover, now that the hostility, treachery, and rebellious aspirations of Gubazes have been revealed on all sides, what difference do the Colchians suppose it makes to them whether he was killed by us or by somebody else? The desire to render loyal service is not the exclusive privilege of generals and other similarly exalted personages. Everyone who feels so inclined has both a right and a duty to show concern for the state of which he is a subject, and to exert himself to the utmost to promote the common good. Likewise, even if to their mind we are the scum of the earth, yet we are loyal and devoted subjects of the emperor. We do have the interests of the Romans at heart, and we are not the sort of men to acquiesce in any attempt at conspiracy. In conclusion, if we must add one further point, it is this. You may rest assured that ours was an honorable, a just, and a timely intervention, and that it was made with the full support of Martin.
Athanasius signaled to John and Rusticus to be quiet and again silently deliberated. After a long, ominous silence with lots of dramatic tension, Athanasius announced that he had reached a decision. He concluded the defense had failed to present evidence of treason on the part of the dearly departed king, and that his killing was therefore entirely unjust and illegal. Athanasius silenced his fellow Romans before they could object. He pointed out that Gubaz scrapped their battle plan at Onoguris not because he was a traitor, but because he correctly saw and was upset that it was not working. As for Martin, he would have to be dealt with at a later date, since he was in fact pivotal to the success at the Battle of Poti. For the time being, he found John and Rusticus guilty of murder and sentenced them to be beheaded immediately. At this, a cheer went up from the crowd. John and Rusticus were sat on mules and paraded through the streets. The Lazi people lined up on all sides and vengefully took part in the spectacle. A herald walked behind them, declaring that Roman law must be upheld and to refrain from murder. The mules reached the scaffold. In full view of everyone, the executioner raised his blade and removed their heads one by one. Roman law was upheld, Lazi honor restored, and the scales of justice were balanced once again with the whistle of a blade and a fountain of blood. To connect with us, feel free to find us on social media under @history_Georgia or on Facebook at The History of Saqartvelo, Georgia. Our intro music is Bindisperia Sopelli by Zadache. To help this podcast continue, please feel free to subscribe to our Patreon or donate via Ko-fi or PayPal. The links are in the episode description. If you would prefer donating something a bit more tangible, we also have an Amazon wishlist for you to peruse. But the best way to help us is via review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your preferred podcast host, as it goes a long way with getting the word out about the show and helping us reach new people about Georgia. Madlabala Nakvamdis, and thank you for listening to The History of Saqartvelo, Georgia. See you next time.
Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions, pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.
Hey, History of Persia fans. Before Persia, another civilization controlled the Middle East, the very first civilization, the inventors of writing itself. From the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia come the oldest stories. The history and myth of the first Mesopotamians is the subject of the Oldest Stories podcast online at oldeststories.net. If you like ancient history, come check out the oldest stories after you listen to this episode.